The following talk was given at the Insight Meditation Center in Redwood City, California. Please visit our website at audiodharma.org.
So over the course of the last few weeks that I've been here, I've been exploring understanding delusion. And I'm just going to continue that exploration today, give a little bit of an overview just to kind of set the context, and for those of you who haven't been hearing all of these reflections on delusion. There's a lot to say around delusion. I think I'm on talk number 4 or 5 at this point. And I have at least 3 more. At least 3 more in this. So I like to think about, delusion often people feel like is inherently we can't be mindful of delusion, or we can't recognize delusion. By its very nature, that people might think that it's not possible to really recognize delusion, at least while it's happening. And I'd like to offer some teaching, some explorations on how we might begin to actually recognize delusion while it's happening. Begin to understand the ways in which we are caught by delusion, and begin to counter those tendencies. Because a lot of our being caught in delusion is habits, patterns of mind. It's kind of our conditioning of how we've been in the world in the past, and we just don't see it. We don't see how we are in relationship to the world. And that itself is a form of delusion, not seeing how we are in relationship to the world. And so there's three I like to break up delusion into 3 categories to explore it, and we've talked about the first 2. The first category is kind of what I'd call the most basic, or in some ways most obvious, but also hardest to be mindful for, that of disconnection from experience. When we're not mindful, that's a form of delusion at work. When we're disconnected from experience, when we're just not present. There's a lot of states of mind that are associated with this. For example, sleepiness, dullness, restlessness, boredom. Often these states are related to being disconnected to experience, or create a disconnection from experience. So sleepiness, for example, often will create a disconnection from experience. And so part of the exploration around delusion in this aspect, we can't be mindful when we're not mindful. It takes waking up again to be mindful. But in that waking up, in the moment of waking up, we begin to see, first of all, a kind of a sense of what it was like to be caught. It was what it was like to not be mindful. Because in that moment when mindfulness returns, there's a lingering memory of what it was like to just be checked out, to not be connected with experience. And so we can begin to, almost in retrospect, understand what the disconnected state is. And then there's also a lot of views that we have about certain states of mind, like sleepiness, like restlessness, like boredom, mostly, I'd say, around low energy states more than high energy states, but around certain low energy states, spacing out, sleepiness, dullness, that kind of state. We have beliefs that it's not possible to be mindful while sleepy, or while low energy, or while spacing out. And that is actually not true. It is possible for the mind to become aware and know this mind is a sleepy mind. This mind is a mind that's spacing out. And in that, again, we begin to see, like, when I recognize spaced out mind, part of what I recognize there is that the mind has created, it's like a buffer between itself and experience in the world. It's created a place where it can rest in disconnection, and yet the mind can be aware of that experience of being stepped back or being disconnected. And so that's another way that we can begin to explore delusion, to begin to explore states of mind in which we typically think it's not possible to be mindful. If you have that thought at any time about any state, it's not possible to be mindful while this is happening, while X is happening, I would encourage you not to believe that thought, because in my own practice, over and over again, anytime I've been curious rather than feeling like, oh, well, not possible to be mindful of that, and instead turning around, well, how might it be possible? Every time I've been able to make inroads, and so it's like the mindfulness can begin to infiltrate those states of mind where we think it's not possible to be mindful. So that's that first area, the disconnected, the area of delusion where we're just not present. It's like, it's like we're asleep while being awake. It's like our mind is just not really relating to what's happening in the world. The second area of delusion that I've talked about in the last few weeks is the area of views, of kind of perspectives that we bring to our lives that we aren't consciously aware of, that we're not aware we're holding. And so we may be aware of what's going on in the world. So it's not that we're disconnected. It's not that we're not aware. There can be a knowing of what's happening while it's happening. And yet there's often, I would say, a view or a perspective that is influencing how we are meeting the world. And so this is a little bit more of a little bit more an insidious kind of delusion. It sneaks in the back door, and it alters or influences how we take in experience. There's a lot of this kind of delusion in our own personal conditioning, and that's what I've talked about in the last few weeks, is the kind of our personal conditioning, the conditioning that we've had from our families, from our our education, from our cultures, that we each have our own set of views we walk around with, our own set of views that some of them are personal views, some of them come from our own particular upbringing and how we were related to. I think I talked about the story of having, I'm nearsighted. My eyes are pretty nearsighted, and so when I was in first grade, before they discovered I was so nearsighted, the teachers knew that they needed to put me in the front row. And so there I was, they put me in the front row. And so this was conditioning for me. I was always in the front row in the classroom from the time I was, in a kindergarten through, fourth grade. And also I was very short. So, that was a good place for me to be able to see the board. But the teachers put me there, and that was a form of conditioning. I got comfortable in the front row, and as I went on in my life, pretty much any time I entered into a situation where there was a kind of a place where there was a speaker and chairs, I would put myself in the front row, and it took me a long time to realize that was conditioning. It wasn't something about me that I had made up this story, it means I'm really interested in what's going on, and maybe I was interested in what's going on, but the conditioning aspect of being put in the front row is what made me comfortable there. And so I think a lot of these personal views, some of them are personal like that, others are cultural. Others are so much of how we live our lives, from how close we stand to somebody that we don't know when we first meet them, how much eye contact we make, whether we make physical contact or not. Those kinds of things, those cultural kinds of things, are views that we hold very deeply in our system. Views about who we are, what we're capable of, views about who others are, what they're capable of. These are all conditioned views, explorations around the ways we create a sense of self and other around economic differences, differences in skin color, differences in sexual orientation, differences in gender orientation, all of those things that we carry based on enculturation. And we apply them to our relationships, often without being aware of them. And so in meeting somebody, we may be mindful, we may be aware when we meet them, we may know that we're talking and seeing, and yet what we may not be aware of is a lot of the enculturation, a lot of the views, a lot of the agendas and opinions that are operating in the background. And so this is another form of delusion, the not being aware of what's operating in the background. This is a huge area of suffering in our world. How much war has been fought in the name of religious perspectives, religious views. You know, that when people hold to their views and are, think of them as this is truth, this is the only way it should be in the world, we run up against conflict, and conflict creates a lot of suffering in our world. We have this kind of suffering around seeing how we separate from each other, and the sense of creating other based on economic condition, based on gender orientation, sexual orientation, skin color, all of those views that we have are often unnoticed. So this is another area of exploration, and it's, a piece about this kind of delusion is that it doesn't mean that we're not seeing what's happening, but instead what tends to happen is what is called in psychology these days confirmation bias. That we hold a view, we hold a perspective, and we tend to seek out information that confirms that view or that bias. And we tend to actually also ignore information that doesn't confirm that bias, that view. And so that is delusion. That we are unaware that that's happening. It's a natural thing. It's a human tendency for that to happen. But we can knowing that this is a tendency that we have, we can begin to counter it. We can begin to be curious about, okay, well, first of all, we have to become aware of our views. That's the first step, become aware that we are carrying views. And then begin to counter those views with other tools, to begin to be curious, maybe about looking for things that would disconfirm our views instead of things that confirm our views. Or maybe just kind of shaking up the mind away from its habitual orientation to a different orientation. In one book that I was reading, it's a wonderful book about looking at our biases around race and racism. It's called Deep Diversity, and it's a fantastic book, and it brings a lot of the tools of mindfulness to this exploration. And so I was reading that book and noticing my own, biases around seeing people of different races. And at one point, in the book, there's a suggestion for when you see somebody that you have a kind of a habitual relationship with based on conditioning, try just dropping in a simple question that makes you more curious about them as a human being, as opposed to as somebody other. And the question that the author proposed And the author's name of the book is Shakil Choudhury. He's a Canadian author. The question he proposed is, I wonder what kind of vegetables they like. I started playing with this question, and it was amazingly powerful. So first thing it takes is some mindfulness to recognize that there's a view operating, and then countering that with a question. And to me, what that question is designed to do is to break down the barriers, or you become curious about the person instead of automatically separating from the person. And so these are some tools around the views, the exploration of views, our personal views, our conditioned views, our enculturated views. So this is another big area of how delusion works. Again, it's not necessary in this case for us to not be mindful, but it's like we're carrying a filter around in the back of our mind, and we're seeing things through that filter, taking certain things in and not other things in. And the delusion there is not being aware, or is kind of believing that we're taking things in accurately, that we believing that we don't have a filter, we don't have a bias. That's the delusion. We almost always are functioning with some kind of bias or some kind of view. And so beginning to be curious, and a great question there is, what am I believing right now? To begin to let some of those views come to the surface. So that's the second kind of delusion. The third kind of delusion is what I would call more human delusion. It is, these are delusions we all share as human beings. It's regardless of culture, regardless of family, we tend to share certain delusions. Partly, I think, because of the way our organism is built. We tend to share these delusions. And the three basic delusions that the Buddha pointed to, we tend to, as human beings, take what is impermanent to be permanent. We tend to take what is unreliable as a source for happiness, as a place to find happiness. We tend to take what's unreliable to be reliable. And we tend to take what is not self, what is not I, me, or mine, to be I, me, or mine. And so these are the next three talks I'd like to explore, is how delusion works in each of these areas. And so today, looking at impermanence, looking at how we take what is impermanent as permanent, and how we can begin to shake that human perspective up a little bit and begin to recognize the impermanent nature of experience. And so we do know that things change at some level. We know that things change. There's a fun poem, actually, that points to this. Let's see if I can find that. So this poem is called The Niagara River. It's by K. Ryan. As though the river were a floor, we position our tables and chairs upon it, eat and have conversation. As it moves along, we notice, as calmly as though dining room paintings were being replaced, the changing scenes along the shore. We do know this is the Niagara River. But it is hard to remember what that means. And so this is how we relate to change often in our lives. We do know we are going to die at some level. We do know that aging happens. We do know that sickness happens. And yet, when these things happen, we feel like either we failed, made a mistake, screwed up somehow, or fatally flawed, or that somehow the universe betrayed us. That somehow there's something fundamentally wrong with the universe. So we either impute some kind of error to ourselves or to the universe, as opposed to recognizing this is nature. This is the way it is. And so one of the first things to begin to recognize is, again, how often we deny or just don't look at, just don't take in impermanence. There's another quote from a great Indian epic poem called the Mahabharata. And one of the characters in that, it's almost like a play. And if you get a chance, there's actually a wonderful enactment of that poem called the Mahabharata by Peter Brook, and it was done in a movie form, and it's quite long. I think it's a 3 or 4 part movie. It's like 8 hours or something, so you can watch it in pieces. And one of the characters in that poem, at one point, is being challenged by an invisible deity, and this invisible deity is challenging him, and is basically gonna kill him if he doesn't answer correctly. What is the greatest wonder? So the deity is asking this character, what is the greatest wonder? And the person responds that every person must one day die, yet everyone lives as if they were immortal. This is the greatest wonder. Only the surface mind understands the language. The actual sense never goes into our heads. This is the greatest wonder. That we're faced with this truth of impermanence daily. It's staring us in the face. These 3 kind of views, impermanent, unreliable, not self, also function very like the views that we pick up in conditioning. It's like they're filters. They're deeper levels of filters on our experience. And even though we see, or there's the possibility of seeing, the evidence of our own mortality, our own aging, that's facing us everywhere, we do not take it in. The actual sense of that truth does not go in. And so we're seeing our lives through this filter of, basically, I'm immortal. Not going to happen to me. I mean, we know that's not true at some level, but deep inside you'll see that that's not how we engage in the world. So it's difficult to take in this truth of impermanence. It's, what we can start to do is begin to recognize, and a simple reflection, the Buddha actually encourages a simple reflection around impermanence, In the Theravada tradition, this is understood as subjects good for frequent recollection. I am of the nature to age. I am of the nature to sicken. I am of the nature to die. And essentially recognizing when we hear about aging, illness, and death, actually that, and we hear about it daily. We hear about it daily. It's easy to push it away when it's happening on the other side of the planet, or in Pennsylvania, or down the street. It's much easier to push it aside if it's not happening directly to myself or a loved one. It's much easier to separate from it. And yet, in a daily way, we can recognize when we hear these kinds of things, we hear these kinds of stories, acknowledge or recognize, yes, I too am subject to that possibility. And daily we hear about car accidents and people being, having heart attacks or dying from cancer, or it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And a simple reflection, this might be me. Partly what that does, it not only begins to undermine that perspective that I'm immortal, that kind of deeply held perspective that I'm immortal, it also begins to connect us to our fellow human beings with that human recognition. We are all, it's not just about me. We are all this vulnerable. We are all this tenuous, fleeting being in the world. This kind of reflecting on our own death, if we regularly reflect on our own death, even just bringing it into mind, reminding ourselves, yes, I am of the nature to die. My family is of the nature to die. One spiritual teacher, Carlos Castaneda, some of you may have heard of Carlos Castaneda, at one gathering apparently, one of the people in the gathering said to Carlos, I find it really hard to connect to a spiritual life. And Carlos Castaneda responded, then reflect regularly that you, your family, your parents, your children, your friends, your relatives, will all die, and in no particular order. You will soon have a spiritual life. It connects us to this reflection of our own death and the death of others, connects us to the fleeting nature of our existence, begins to connect us in part to how do I want to live in this fleeting world? How do I want to live in this fleeting existence? It seems like it might be depressing to reflect on impermanence. That's the surface mind thinks that. Our surface mind thinks, I don't want to reflect that I'm going to die, I'll just get depressed. It'll just bum me out. And we also think, if I just think I'm going to die, then I won't want to do anything. But what I've seen is actually just the opposite of all of those. When I bring death to mind, when I know this life is fleeting, I have no idea whether I'm going to make it home today. I actually have no idea whether I'm going to leave here today. When I reflect on that, it's not depressing. It actually inspires me to connect to what is most important to me. It inspires me to live my life more fully, more meaningfully, than just going through thinking I've got another 35 years left in this body. That's a long time. If I think, I don't even know if I've got another second left in this body, I want to make this moment mean something. I want to be here for it. And so this reflection on impermanence, reflecting on our aging, our sickness, our death, this is the obvious level of impermanence that's available to us. We can reflect on this easily, and it can begin to make some inroads into this kind of delusion. There are different levels of impermanence, this most obvious kind being the easiest one to connect with, perhaps with reflection. As we begin to be more in tune with our actual experience in meditation, we touch into some deeper levels of impermanence, or more maybe influx levels of impermanence. I think part of the reason why it's harder to recognize the impermanent nature of our lives is because we've been going on for as long as we've been going on. It's like it's been here for all this time. Why shouldn't it be here for all the next time? So we've created this idea of a kind of an ongoing process that doesn't seem like it's likely to stop anytime soon. So that some of these reflections around aging, sickness, death, they can be done in the immediate moment level when we actually hear about aging, sickness, and death, and remind ourselves that too, that might be me. And so connecting with the actual experience of really taking in somebody else's death or somebody else's illness, and realizing that might be me. There's an experience there. We begin to recognize what our relationship is to that truth. And this is very useful, to recognize our relationship to that and begin to explore that relationship. And as we become more curious about being present for our experience, noticing what's happening in our lives, what's going on moment to moment, we begin to see there's a lot of change going on. There's change within ourselves, change outside. Nothing lasts for very long, but things seem to, like this building seems to be quasi-stable. It's pretty stable. It wouldn't take too much to have it vanish. A fire, a plane crash into it, or so we know that it's not really permanent. Just if we let it go, if we just stopped maintaining it, eventually the redwood tree outside, its roots would grow up and it would begin to decay the building. So we know that it's kind of impermanent. And so beginning to touch into the ways in which everyday impermanence shows itself to us. This is another level. So noticing how, for instance, our bodies change. How one day we feel good, another day we feel tired, and so the changing kind of moods and mind states that come along with being a human being. We impute a kind of a permanent underlying sense of me experiencing all these changing things, but we can begin to recognize that moods and emotions, in particular, are very fluid. We tend to identify, or we tend to believe to some extent in the, like, for instance, I have a history in my life of having a lot of anger, a lot of that being a kind of conditioned experience in my life. And I initially kind of thought that what was going on was like I had this permanent like pool of anger, and just every now and then it's like I dropped into that pool. And what I've So that it was kind of like I was imputing a kind of permanence to that anger. So even when I wasn't angry or miserable, that was another way this manifested itself. Even when I wasn't miserable, there was my mind saying something like, well, yeah, but I know what I am is really miserable. So even if I was happy, if I was happy, it's like, well, I'm happy now, but I know that what I am is really miserable. And so there was an imputation of a kind of permanent nature or kind of solid nature to some of my habitual emotions and moods. And as I started to meditate and began to recognize that sometimes anger was there, sometimes it wasn't, sometimes miserable was there, sometimes it wasn't, I began noticing actually the absence of my habitual patterns. This is, in a way, beginning to recognize the impermanent nature of our moods, our emotions. I began to see that actually those emotions are created in the moment. It's not like there's a pool of anger. There are some tendencies in the mind. I think I understand this to be the neuronal wirings. There's some patterns that are wired that tend to fire. But when that pattern is not firing, it's not just sitting there waiting. Actually, it is. There's a way in which it's sitting there waiting. But the way our brains work, what I understand from neuroplasticity, is if that pattern sits there for long enough and is not engaged in, those neurons basically the way our brains work is those neurons say, well, this one must not be important anymore. Let's rewire. And so the non-engagement with the beginning to recognize the pattern of our habitual patterns is sometimes being present, sometimes not being present, supports the beginning of the rewiring of that pattern. And so the impermanent nature of our own emotional habits and patterns, really useful to start to see. It begins to poke holes in our beliefs around those habitual patterns, habitual emotions. Sometimes they come up and it feels like, oh, I'm going to be depressed forever, or this is how it's going to be for the rest of whatever, a week or month. That's in a way imputing a kind of permanence. If we actually start looking at our emotions, we begin, and it's non-awareness in a way when we're partly the way that this works is that when we impute a permanence to certain kinds of emotional states, it's like our habit of confirmation bias has us recognize when we're experiencing those things, and not as much recognizing when we're not experiencing them. And so the imputation of kind of like, well, I've been miserable for the last 3 months. I've been depressed for the last 3 months. I'm going to be depressed for the next 3 months. Exploring in your moment-to-moment experience, is that actually true? Am I depressed constantly, or is there some change to that? Again, so this imputation of permanence creates a kind of a suffering around our, especially our reactive emotions, those ones that we feel like are challenging, that have a hold on us. Begin to recognize when they're not happening. Begins to punch through the delusion that they are constant. And so if you've got a period or a stretch of time where it feels like, oh, I've been depressed for a week, start looking for the next week at the fluctuations in that state. You may find that there are actually moments, they may be brief, but there are actually moments when for a few moments there's a lifting of that. There's a delight in something that you see or hear. And so taking that in, punching holes in the idea of the permanent nature of those states. And then at a subtler level, an even subtler level, impermanence is just a feature of every split second of experience. This is harder to see, and again, partly based on our human apparatus, our sense experience. There are ways in which our sense experience is designed to create stability in our world. It's designed to create, like for instance, as I look around this room, what comes into my eyes is this like rapidly changing, dynamic, shifting experience. It's like different images, moment after moment. No one of them is the same. And yet my experience isn't that this room is like jumping around and changing. My experience is that there's a stability here. So this is part of the way our perceptual apparatus works, to create this sense of stability. And this helps us to navigate the world. Absolutely helps us to navigate the world. Thank goodness I can, get up and walk through that spot in the chairs without bumping into it, even as I'm looking in various other ways. It's like our perceptual apparatus serves us to navigate the world. And yet, the delusion associated with it is that we impute a permanence to our experience based on this perceptual apparatus. Essentially, as I look around the room and that in the eye field, there's actually this incredibly dynamic shifting, and I can kind of see it. It makes me a little dizzy when I orient to it. And so I think this is part of the reason why our mind tends to orient to the concept level of experience. What we actually meet as we explore experience a lot, what we're actually taking in or relating to, are the concepts rather than the actual experience. And this is where the delusion comes in. Because concepts, when they're not seen as concepts often hold a lot of baggage. They hold a lot of ideas, views, opinions. And so we're not only seeing our experience through a concept, we're seeing it through the concept plus our views about the concept. And so going back to the example around economic disparity, for example, a view around that, seeing somebody who is homeless, for instance, seeing that person, there's not only the seeing. It's not just seeing, and it's not just seeing a person. It's seeing a person as a homeless person, and seeing a person with perhaps baggage that comes along with that. Beliefs, views, ideas, how they became homeless, what they do, how they engage, why they either deserve that or don't deserve that. All kinds of views come in that relationship. And very similarly, in our relationship just to this rapidly changing nature of experience, basically the view that we're seeing things as they actually are is a form of delusion, because things are changing so rapidly. How much time is there? I think I've got time for this example. Partly the way I talked about the kind of shifting slideshow nature of looking around the room, and how the mind creates a kind of stability or solidity around that. There was an example of this that I saw. It was a pretty amazing example of how powerful this creation of the illusion of solidity is in our minds at the Exploratorium in San Francisco. This was a number of years ago. I don't know if the exhibit is still up or not. I haven't been in a number of years. But I went with my nephew who was 10 years old at the time. And we walked into the exploratorium and, just kind of this big kind of cavernous room and all the little exhibits around. And one thing was up on the ceiling, these flashing lights on bars. There were these flashing lights on bars hanging on the ceiling. And I looked up at that and just saw flashing lights on the bars. And I thought, I wonder what that is. I'll have to check that out later. And the way the bars were hung, they were probably maybe 6 feet tall or maybe taller. I don't know. They were pretty high up. So they were pretty big. Maybe 6 to 10 foot long rods hanging from the ceiling. And there were maybe about 15 or 20 of those rods hanging probably about 3 or 4 feet apart. So rods hanging from the ceiling. And on each rod there were flashing lights for the whole length of the rod. So that's kind of what I saw when I first walked in, kind of bunch of just randomly flashing lights on these rods hanging from the ceiling. And then my nephew and I sat down for a little while to have a drink, and I noticed he was looking up at the rods, and he said, "Oh, it's a school bus." And I looked up and I saw a bunch of like yellow flashing lights and a little bit of red flashing. I thought, well, what? I see it's kind of the color of lights that it would be if it was a school bus, but I don't see a school bus. And then he said, "Oh, it's butterflies." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And at some point I stopped and I was just like, okay, I want to see what's going on here. And it took some kind of a relaxation of the eyes. But what happened as the eyes began to relax is that essentially what appeared in midair was a movie screen. And across that movie screen was driving a school bus. The detail that I could see in that visual image was good enough for me to read the name of the school district on the side of the school bus. And then it changed to butterflies. Then there were butterflies flying across the screen. I knew that there was not a screen up there. And yet the illusion was so powerful that the mind created that kind of permanence, or that illusion of the permanence. This is, part of this is, again, it's just the way our system, it works, that it will create that kind of continuity on moment to moment, just little blips of information. With moment to moment little blips of information, our mind can construct a world. But what's constructed is constructed in our minds. Everything, absolutely everything we experience, all that we know of it is what our minds create. And this again is how this delusion is so powerful, because we do not understand that everything, absolutely everything we experience, that I come in contact with, is a creation of my mind. Everything that we each come in contact with, everything that we experience is created by our minds. And because of that, there is this real doorway when we're not aware that we are perceiving things in this very dynamic way. It's very easy for views, opinions, ideas, agendas to slip in and influence or skew how we are taking in that information. And so, in terms of this kind of impermanence masked as permanence, the exploration I like to engage in is to begin to look at or recognize, what am I taking to be solid? What am I taking to have some kind of solidity. Even in my meditation experience, this is a helpful place to play with it, actually, to begin to see just how dynamically changing everything is. If you pick some particular strong experience of body, for instance, maybe a pain, or maybe even just the pressure of your hips against the chair or cushion or bench, feels kind of solid. Feels kind of, it's like. But if you start to actually touch into the actual experience of that, we begin to recognize it's not hips on chair that we're actually experiencing. That's the concept, hips on chair. When we experience it as hips on chair, it feels pretty solid. But what actually is going on is this very dynamic, tingling, pulsing, vibrating experience that has very little solidity to it. We can begin to get underneath the concept to recognize what is actually happening moment to moment is very dynamic, is very impermanent. Again, the purpose of this in terms of our practice and our spiritual life is that as we begin to really deeply touch into the impermanent nature, not only of the moment-to-moment experience, but of our lives, of that we are mortal, it begins to really open us to the human nature of our experience. As we touch into the rapidly changing experience, we recognize this isn't about me. This is not personal. As we begin to really acknowledge and recognize, yes, this human body is subject to death, we realize it's not about me. It's not personal. We realize that holding on and trying to control, manipulate, to fix things so that I never die is doomed as a project to failure. That we're holding on to things that are unreliable. And in this way, pointing to the other kinds of delusions or misperceptions the Buddha points to, these other two kind of misperceptions, the unreliability of experience, taking what's unreliable to be reliable, taking what's not self to be self. In many ways, those misperceptions are based on the more fundamental misperception around impermanence. And so seeing impermanence in and of itself may seem like, well, okay, I get impermanence, but what it supports for us is a movement in the direction of letting go, of trying to hold on to things that are not a reliable place for lasting happiness. Because so much of our suffering results from trying to hold on to something that is just slipping through our fingers. Or so much suffering comes along from imputing a sense of me or I am to something and feeling like we have to somehow maintain or control that perception of this is who I am. So much suffering for me came from I counteracted a whole pattern of self-hatred with an I'm really competent pattern. And any time the self-competence was revealed to be impermanent because I couldn't be continuously competent, I would shift into a kind of depression around being a failure. So our identification with, our kind of imputing something to be I or me or mine, another big way in which we suffer. And so this is the point of this exploration, really, to begin to recognize the ways in which this misperception creates the conditions for struggle, stress, unease. And as we begin to see through that misperception, it's not, again, it's paradoxically not depressing that everything is impermanent. It actually creates a lot of freedom, a lot of ease, and happiness in our lives when we let go of trying to control, trying to hold on to. So, it's 11, so need to stop. Thank you for your attention. Next week, unreliability.